Triggers. You either learn triggers in Apex or you can just take your whole Salesforce developer career and throw it out of the window, because this is one of the most important topics. And in this video, I'm gonna show you how to learn everything you need about triggers and how not to get crazy and how to learn it fast instead of spending months and months trying to grind it out. So what one thing is what people usually do when they are, let's say you're an admin or a business analyst or someone who is not a developer. What people do is that they go for fancy, very nice sounding topics like integrations, right? So I'm gonna learn integrations. That's so fun. I'm gonna learn LWC. I'm gonna learn Visual Force. I'm gonna learn Aura, Batch, you name it, all the other fun topics, and then they don't learn triggers properly. But let me tell you this: you can throw this away. This is completely irrelevant if you don't learn triggers. There's literally no point in learning all of this unless you're good at triggers, because triggers is the fundament, right? So if you can imagine like a house that you're building, right? You're building a house. You first, what do you do in the house? You first put out the fundament in this house, right? Otherwise the house is just gonna fall to the debris and it's not gonna work. So if you don't have this fundamental, and in Salesforce development those are triggers, you won't be able to do anything else. Of course, technically you can go and learn LWC and integrations, right? And you will be able to understand them, but what's the point? What's the freaking point in understanding them if you won't be able to do proper job on your work? Because probably every single org that you have, right? You open any single org and they're gonna have triggers inside in one or another form, right? So this is why you need to learn it. Another reason why you need to learn it is because flows, right? You guys all probably are very big fans of flows, right? Flow is basically a trigger. Do you know that flow is probably internally is getting translated to a trigger, right? So at the end, everything is about triggers in Salesforce. And on top of that, the first the first thing that Salesforce introduced in Apex as a language, when they just developed the language, it was, guess what? Triggers. It was the first thing they created with a language. So this must tell you how important it is. It is so important to understand it that I cannot just emphasize it enough. You have to understand it very well. So how exactly how do you do it, right? So all right. So this is you. This is you. And if you're watching this video, you're probably a little bit confused how to exactly learn those triggers. And the first thing that you need to understand is that the trigger is actually this database concept, right? So this is a concept that comes first from databases. Because what is a Salesforce? Salesforce is essentially a database which has a nice looking user interface, right? So the whole Salesforce thing is just basically a nice database which is just shown for us in a very nice way. So the concept of a trigger, right? The concept of a trigger, it comes from the databases. So when you're going to be learning triggers, you also need to learn a little bit about the databases. And this is what I usually recommend people to have as the step number one. You need to learn databases. Not crazy, right? Don't go crazy and spend like days on it. No, just go read a couple of things, watch a couple of videos, spend like in total maybe 5 hours learning learning databases. Nothing too crazy, okay? I almost said integrations. Oh my god, that would be quite a quite a mistake to make. So yeah, databases. Spend like 5 hours just getting to know how databases work. um, the next thing that you need to learn is that let's just dive into what is the trigger, right? So a trigger, what is kind of the trigger or triggers? When you think about this, what does the word imply, right? The word imply is that something happens, right? So there is some kind of action. There's some kind of action happening there, right? Let me pull myself here. So there's some kind of action happening there, and based on this action, there's some kind of response to this action. Yeah, some kind of response. So the trigger is the capture of this action. Trigger, right? And the response, this is the code that you write on your own, right? So this is the code that you actually need to learn how to write. So the first and probably most important concept in triggers are the context variables. Context variables. Context variables. Variables. They give us information about this whole context there, right? So you need to learn them pretty well. But before that, let's go before that. Before you learn the context variables, you need to learn stuff like events, right? So trigger events. What can happen here, right? What kind of event can happen? Well, if we think what kind of events do we have in Salesforce in general, or what kind of actions can we perform with data in general? What can you do with data? You can create new data, right? You can delete data, or you can modify data. Modify data, right? So if you create data, this is what we in Salesforce call insert, right? We insert a new data in the database, delete stays delete, and modify is called update. Update, right? And then there is also additional one that we have in Salesforce. So this is Salesforce. This is real life, right? So we have additional one. It's undelete, right? So it's not actual operation that you can perform with data. It's more of a undoing an operation that you can perform, but still it is in Salesforce, right? Now, I'm not gonna go very deep into all these topics, right? I'm not gonna teach you like exactly here's what you do, because otherwise this video is gonna be like 20 hours. I just want to show you what you need to learn in triggers so that you have like a good plan how exactly it looks like, okay? And also a very common mistakes, because a lot of people, they kind of stop in the first two steps, right? I'm going to show you what are the first two steps, and most people, they stop in those two steps and they're like, I learned triggers. No, I'm going to show you how to move forward, not to get stuck on those things. All right, so you have insert, delete, and update, those most important. And this is what we call events, right? So you need to understand how those events, how they work in Salesforce. So for example, if you have a contact, right? If you go to Salesforce and if you have a contact there, and you take this contact and you insert this contact, right? So this is Salesforce. This is Salesforce, right? You insert the contact into the Salesforce in the user interface. So what's going to happen is that it will take this contact and it will put it into database, right? So the contact, let me make it red. The contact is going to go to the Salesforce, and then Salesforce is going to put it to the database, right? So this is the usual thing. Now, when it end up in the database, this is where a certain trigger happens, yeah? This is where we can say that, that the trigger is happening. So now the Salesforce is trigger, okay? And based on this trigger, this is where we can write some script. What kind of trigger is it, and what kind of script is it? We are defining on our own, okay? So usually this script, this is what you call trigger, right? So in this whole scenario where we're inserting something into database, that's what we call a trigger. Then another option, what we can have, is that if we, instead of inserting a new contact, we are taking this contact and we are modifying it, right? Then we again end up with a trigger, right? And then we can say, okay, if we have this trigger, then execute another script. So in the nutshell, this is how triggers work, right? So you need to understand also this part. You see, this is the database part, right? This is what you need to understand a little bit, the database part. And you need to understand how to capture basically those events, right? What are before insert? Let me write it down for you, right? So we have stuff like like before. This is something that you need to learn, right? So you need to learn before and you need to learn after, and then together with them we can combine insert, update, or delete, right? So in total there should be 7. This is terrible, 7. Should be 7 events, right? So it should be before insert, before update, before delete, and the same goes with the after. It goes after insert, after update, and after delete. Yeah, so those things, and then plus additional undelete, right? Undelete. So that's why we have 7 and not 6 together. Okay, so this is usually the step number 1, right? So this is the step number 1. What you do is to just understand very simple triggers, right? So what the hell is the trigger? How you can capture those events? What are the events before insert, after insert? What's happening there? Then you also need to do context variables, right? So this is also that all goes into the first step, right? So the first step is basically very simple. I usually call it simple triggers. Okay. All right. Now this is step number 1. Now the step number 2 would be this. You need to learn how to capture a change, right? So if we take analogy with the flow, for example, in flow you have stuff where, for example, if you have a field, let's take example with the opportunity, right? So let's say you have an opportunity. You have an opportunity here, right? So this is opportunity, and let me make it a bit bigger. So this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity, and this opportunity, it is qualification. Qualification, right? It is in the status of qualification. Now, someone updates this opportunity to be in the status of closed, lost, right? And when we update to the closed, lost status, what we want to do is that we want to kind of find the reason why it was lost. So what we want to do is that we want to send an email to the business, to, let's say, someone who is responsible for those analyzation. Let's say RevOps, or something around this, right? Just your boss or manager, right? So you want to send an email to this person. Now, this sounds like a relatively simple use case, right? And this is what is relatively easy to do with the flows, because you can just say, okay, so this field, it was changed, right? It was changed, and on the change, do something. And this is exactly what you need to learn on the second step. The second step, what I usually call real life cases, right? So you need to learn basically those more real life, realistic cases, what's going on with the triggers. And that means that you need to learn this capture of the change, and for that you need to know maps. You need to learn maps. It's relatively easy to do in Apex, right? So you need to know maps and context variables, right? Context variables you probably already learned from the last time. Context variables, right? So, but this is where you need to understand how maps work. And this is why I always say that you cannot start with the triggers as your first ever topic in Salesforce, right? You need to know how to code before. I have a separate video on this, right? So you need to know how to code, and only then you can go to the stuff like triggers, right? You cannot just immediately skip to the triggers. No, you need to be able to code. Because if you don't know how to use map, you will not be able to learn this case here, right? It means if you're not able to learn this case, well, that means you cannot learn triggers. If you cannot learn triggers, there's no point in learning anything else. So you have to go back and learn and understand maps, right? And then the additional topic that you need to understand there, of course, loops, but I kind of just say that it's should be quite obvious that you need to be able to understand those topics, okay? So maps, this is what you use. Context variables, right? Context variables. And the new topic that comes here is bulkification. bulkification. Okay, so you need to understand how, like, what is the bulkification? Why do we need to bulkify a trigger? Why not? Yeah. Okay, so if you understand this, this is usually where people stop. So people say, I learned how to do the triggers, right? They learn all of this and they're like, yay, I am done. I am done with the triggers. And this is a big mistake, right? Let me draw someone. Let me draw the typical person, right? They're like, well, yeah, I've done triggers because this is what's on Trailhead, right? This is where Trailhead usually stops. Trailhead is like, yes, you are excellent, you mastered triggers. But this is just probably about 30% of triggers. So this is not the way they're actually done in the real world. And when I'm hiring for someone, right? When I'm hiring, I am looking not for those type of things that we discussed so far. Those are only the first two steps. If I can see that the person only knows those two steps and doesn't know anything else, for me that immediately means that this person is probably either self-taught or this person just is not deep enough, does not understand triggers deep enough, or doesn't have any work experience, right? So don't stop on this step, because if you stop on this step, you're gonna have very hard times with the interviews, right, for developer roles. Okay, so what's the next step? What's the step number 3? The step number 3 is trigger. Guess what? Handlers. Handlers. Trigger handlers are relatively simple, right? So this is the next step. So basically, what is a trigger handler? Trigger handler is where you take your whole system and you kind of separate it down into 3 different parts. So you say this is part number 1, this is part number 2, and I can make it a bit smaller actually. This is part number 3, and sometimes you also add part number 4 to it, right? So this is a little bit more optional, the part number 4. Okay, so let's call this database. Database, yeah. Why is it so small? Can we make it? Can we make it a bit bigger here? Right, probably not. Anyway, doesn't matter. Okay, so usually we separate it into 3 different parts. The first is something that actually fires the trigger, right? So this is, let me write it down here. This is something that fires, or usually the way we call it is the entry point, or point of entry into the code, entry point into the code, right? So this is basically the way your code starts, right? So this is the way, this is where it all starts. For our case, that's going to be usually the trigger itself, right? So this is going to be the trigger. It's going to be the trigger. This is where everything starts. And now what happens is that this entry point just calls another layer, which is called delegator. Delegator. So this is delegator layer, or basically this is handlers. Handlers. So the task of the handlers is basically just to identify what kind of logic needs to be called here, because this is the logic layer. This is the logic layer. And here we have like method 1, method 2, method 3, so on, right? And the task of a handler to know which one of those methods to call, right? And this is why it's also called delegator sometimes, because basically the whole idea behind this, that it kind of delegates the actual work down the layer, right? And that's how the trigger handlers work, right? So this trigger handler is very simple, just class. This one is also just a simple class, just Apex class, and this is just trigger, right? So this is an actual trigger, and this usually what we call service, right? So we also have usually work here with the different services. There are different names for that, but that's approximately how the trigger handler architecture is basically created. Okay, and then sometimes people add their kind of like another layer of um, database interaction. So for example, there's sometimes people call them selectors. Sometimes there's also other fancy names. I usually just call them queries. I don't like to use um, fancy names, right? And this is the layer that usually interacts with the database itself, right? So if we have database here, that's usually the way to kind of abstract away the database interaction, right? So instead of interacting directly with database, we would interact with this layer instead, right? So this is the kind of the architecture that you need to understand. And I totally understand that it's very hard to understand what the hell is going on here in this architecture. That's why you need to read books. That's why you need to take courses, like for example, the cohort that I'm going to be running, or take the Learn Apex platform that I'm also going to attach down below, right? If you want to understand all of these things, you cannot find this information on Trailhead. They just don't explain it, right? So you need to be able to use those type of things, and you need to be able to explain this, because if you don't understand this, you will never be hired as anything more than junior developer, right? If you ever want to be more than a junior Salesforce developer, then you have to understand all of this. Otherwise, I personally wouldn't just hire you for any other role rather than junior. Okay, even for juniors, you need to understand this. Even to get hired as a junior right now, the the level is a bit higher. You need to understand all of this, right? And this is only step number 3. This is not all, because there comes another step, and the another step is step number 4, and this is trigger framework, or better to say frameworks. Frameworks, right? Many frameworks or one framework. Essentially, what it is that trigger framework is the same thing what we have here, right? The same thing, the similar architecture or the same architecture. We copy it, so it's the same architecture, and we just elevate it and we make it professional. We add stuff like, for example, recursion control, right? We add stuff like being able to control the order of execution, right? Order of execution. Wait a second, what the hell is that? What's going on? I can only see myself. Wait a second. Okay, now everything is back. Yep. So we have stuff like recursion, for example, so that your trigger doesn't go into the recursion with itself, right? Order of execution. If you have multiple triggers, what do you do? If you have trigger 1, trigger 2, trigger 3, how do you actually can rearrange them that they are exactly executing in exactly this order, right? How you can do that? All of this is what basically the trigger framework take care of. Now, what you need to do usually at this stage is that of course, the trigger framework is just free. You can just go download it. But usually, what you need to do here is that you need to rebuild the trigger framework on your own. Okay, so you need to rebuild the trigger framework, because the only way to make it good, to actually really understand what's going on, is to just rebuild everything yourself. Once you rebuild it, you will never ever forget how it works, right? So you never will forget it if you build it once. Okay, so trigger framework. And this is where a lot of even advanced developers stop, but this is not all, because the next thing that you need to learn to really master triggers, thing number 5, and this is a new thing. It haven't been there 2 years ago or maybe even 1 year ago, but you need to do trigger action framework. Action framework. Okay, trigger action framework. So you basically need to learn how to use this trigger framework, but in a little bit different way, because trigger action framework is exactly the same as trigger framework, right? It's just an improvement using actions. Actions. What it allows us to do is that instead of basically, if this is a trigger framework, instead of having a big like a monument implementation, what we have is if we do actions instead, right? If we separate it into the actions, we have many smaller actions. Okay, so this is what the trigger action framework is all about, right? So it simplifies a little bit the what's going on? It simplifies a little bit the. Why is it not transparent? Here we go. Yeah. So it simplifies the trigger framework, and this is a newer way to do it, right? So this haven't been out for a long time, so there is not that many orgs that using this, but it's very good and it's very helpful, right? So this is what you need to learn, and those the last steps, like step number 3, 4, and 5 are absolutely crucial. It's maybe it sounds for you like it's optional and you can stop with the 1 and 2. No, you can't, because you need to understand how it's done in real world. Okay, no one actually does it with just using plain triggers. That would be wrong. If you try to use plain triggers for long enough, for like 12 months, 13 months, let's say 13 months, 15 months, right? Something around this, you will see a lot of problems with triggers. And this is why you need to use the trigger handlers, you need to use trigger framework, you need to learn how to use trigger action framework, right? So you need to learn all of this, and only then you will be able to say that you master triggers. But after you do that, you will be able to nail literally every interview that is out there. So you will be able to go into the interview and know that you know everything about triggers. Okay, so this is how you do it. Good luck. If you need any help, then join the cohort that we're going to be running next week. And also, you can always have the self-paced course with the Learn Apex. So that's all. Good luck.